Good morning, dear students. Today I am going to start chapter 23rd. The title of this chapter is The Keynesian Framework in the ISLM Model. In this particular chapter, we will be focusing on the Keynesian framework and then we will try to develop the ISLM model. As you know that in the media, you often see forecast of GDP and interest rate by economists and government agencies. The economists usually make their prediction using a variety of economic models. They are trying to predict the future GDP, or they are trying to predict the future rate of interest by developing different economic models. One model widely used by economic forecasters or economists is the ISLM model. Actually, ISLM model is the one model which is used by the economists to forecast. Actually, the concept of ISLM model was initially developed by John Hicks in the year 1937, and the ISLM model is actually based on the analysis in J.M. Keynes. J.M. Keynes had written a book in the year 1936. The title of the book was The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The ISLM model explains how interest rates and total output produce in the economy. Actually, this model is trying to explain how interest rates and total output produced in the economy are determined given a fixed price level. It means that when we are studying the ISLM framework or when we are studying the Keynesian framework, so J.M. Keynes has taken the price level fixed in his analysis. The ISLM model is valuable not only because it can be used in economic forecasting, as I told you that this is the model which we are using in economic forecasting, but this model also provides a deeper understanding of how government policy can affect aggregate economic activity. So there are two main purposes to understand the ISLM model. The first and most important purpose of the ISLM model is to forecast. It means that this model is used by the economists to forecast certain macroeconomic indicators. And the second important objective of studying the ISLM model is that it provides a deeper understanding of how government policy can affect aggregate economic activity. It means that if there is a change in the fiscal policy, which is the policy of the government, or if there is a change in the monetary policy, which is the policy of the central bank of a country. So how changes in fiscal policy or monetary policy can affect the aggregate level of output, how changes in these policies can affect the interest rates in the economy or the aggregate output level. It means that we use the ISLM model to evaluate the effects of monetary policy and fiscal policy on the economy and to learn some lessons about how monetary policy might best be conducted. So this is the basic objective of developing the ISLM model. So I am going to start my lecture by developing the simplest framework for determining the aggregate output in which all economic actors, for example, consumers, firms, and other economic actors except the government play a role. It means that we are going to start the simplest model. And in this simplest model, especially consumers and producers are playing their key role in the determination of output. However, for the sake of simplicity, we are keeping the role of the government on one side. It means that we are considering the role of government as given or the role of government as fixed. It means that in our analysis, we are not dealing the actions taken by the government in order to determine the aggregate output level in an economy. As you know that the government is developing a policy which is known as fiscal policy. And fiscal policy has two important components. The first important component is known as government spending, and the second important component of the fiscal policy is known as taxes. First, we are going to develop a very simple framework. After that, we will include the government sector. It means that we will try to investigate the impact of government spending and taxes on the aggregate output. That if there are changes in government spendings, how it will affect the aggregate output, or if there are changes in taxes by the government, how this action or how this policy will affect the aggregate output. But at the moment, we are keeping the role of government on a side, and we are trying to study or we are trying to investigate only the behavior of the consumers as well as producers in the determination of aggregate output. And after that, we will try to investigate the impact of monetary policy. And you know that the monetary policy variables include the money supply and the interest rate. It means that how the interest rate will affect the aggregate output, or how changes in the interest rate will affect. Let me start the model from the most and the simplest model, which is known as determination of output. Actually, in this topic, we are trying to study that how the output level in an economy is determined. Actually, Keynes was especially interested in understanding moments of aggregate output because he wanted to explain why the Great Depression had occurred and how government policy could be used to increase employment in a similar economic situation. It means that when we are studying the topic determination of output, it means that we are studying the theory or we are studying the analysis of the J.M. Keynes. J.M. Keynes was interested in understanding moments of aggregate output. Actually, he was interested to know that how changes or moments in aggregate output occurred, that what are the factors causing change in the aggregate output level. So he wanted to explain why the Great Depression in 1929 had occurred and how government policy could be used to increase employment in a similar economic situation. If the economy again experiences such kind of recessions, such kind of depressions in the economy, how the government policies could be used to improve the severe economic conditions, or how the government policy can be used to increase the employment level. Actually, Keynes' analysis started with the recognition that the total quantity demanded of an economy's output was the sum of four types of spending. This was the basic analysis or the basic view of the J.M. Keynes. Keynes stated that the recognition that the total quantity demanded of an economy's output was the sum of four types of spending. Number one, consumer spending or consumer expenditures. Number second, planned investment spending or planned investment expenditures. Number third, government spending or government expenditures. Number four, net exports. Let me explain you each component of the aggregate demand one by one. Number one, consumer expenditures or consumer spending. In macroeconomics, we are using the symbol capital C for consumer spending. And consumer spendings are actually the total demand for consumer goods and services during a particular course of time. For example, hamburgers, stereos, rock concerts, visits to the doctor, and so on. So different goods and services Second, planned investment spending or planned investment expenditures. The planned investment expenditures are denoted by the symbol I in macroeconomics. The planned investment spendings refers the total planned spending by businesses on new physical capital plus planned spending on new homes. It means that businesses are spending money on new physical capital, for example, machines, computers, factories, raw materials, and so on. These are the spending on new physical capital. And similarly, planned spending on new homes. Number third, government spending. The government spending is denoted by the symbol G in macroeconomics. And the government spending refers the spending by all levels of government on goods and services. For example, aircraft carriers, government workers, red tape, and so on are different developmental expenditures are expenditures made by the government on the military. And the last one is known as the net exports. Net exports is denoted by NX. Net exports means the net foreign spending on government or on domestic goods and services, and it is equal to exports minus imports. You know that we are subtracting imports from exports. The question is why? We are subtracting imports from exports and arriving at the net export components. When we are using the word net, it means that we are subtracting something from another thing. It means imports from exports. So imports are subtracted from exports and arriving at the net export component of the total quantity demanded of an economy's output. Why? Because imports are already counted in consumption, investment, and government expenditures, but do not add to the demand for the economy output. That's why we are subtracting the value of imports from the value of exports. The total quantity demanded of an economy's output is known as the aggregate output. And in macroeconomics, we are using the symbol YAD. It means aggregate output or aggregate demand. We know that Keynes is taking the price level aspects. It means there is no role of prices in the analysis or in the determination of aggregate output. So price level is fixed. And this is the aggregate demand. YAD is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. YAD is known as the aggregate demand. The first component of this aggregate demand is C, and C represents the consumer spending or the consumer expenditure. The second component, which is I denotes the planned investment spending. The third component of this model is G, where G represents the government spending. And the last component of this model, which is NX. This NX represents net exports, or we can say that exports minus imports. When we subtract imports from exports, we can get the net value. So this is the aggregate demand function or the aggregate demand model, where we can say that the aggregate demand of an economy is the sum of consumer spending, planned investment spending, government spending, and net exports. When you use your common concept from supply and demand analysis, we can say that demand is equal to supply. Similarly, In this context, Keynes recognized that equilibrium would occur because in the general market, we can say that when the quantity demanded of a commodity is equal to its supply, the market is in equilibrium. It means equality of demand and supply is the basic condition of market equilibrium. Similarly, Keynes recognized that equilibrium would occur in the economy when total quantity of output supplied equals quantity of output demanded. Quantity of output demanded is represented here in this analysis by YAD. We are representing the total quantity of output supplied or the aggregate output produced by Y. So this is the equilibrium condition. In the equilibrium condition, we are saying that Y is equal to YAD. It means that the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply. This is the equilibrium condition. If the aggregate demand becomes equal to the aggregate supply, we can say that the market is in equilibrium. If this equilibrium condition is satisfied, producers are able to sell all of their output and have no reason to change their production. It means the amount of production produced by the firm is supplied to the market. It means there is no surplus output. J. M. Keynes' analysis explains two important things. Number one, that why aggregate output is at a certain level, which means understanding what factors affect each component of aggregate demand. We need to understand what factors affect each component of aggregate demand. It means that we need to understand what are the factors affecting these four components. And the second important point of the J. M. Keynes analysis is how the sum of these components can add up to an output smaller than the economy is capable of producing, resulting in less than full employment of resources. As you know that there is a situation which is known as full employment level. It means that the economy is producing the output by using the full capacity level. The economy is at its peak level. It means that there are no idle resources. The economy is utilizing all economic resources to produce a certain amount of output. So J. Imkins was especially concerned with explaining the low level of output and employment during the Great Depression. That's why during the course of Great Depression, the output level is low. Why there is a huge unemployment during the course of the Great Depression. So Keynes was especially interested to know, he was especially interested to explain why there is a low level of output and employment during the Great Depression period because inflation was not a serious problem during this period. You know that there are two major problems when the Great Depression had occurred. Number one, the aggregate output level was low. That was very low. So it means the Great Depression affected the aggregate output severely. And the second point is the highest unemployment rate. So inflation was not a serious issue during that period. That's why J. Imkins assumed that output could change without causing a change in prices. As you know that the J. Imkins analysis assumes that the price level is fixed. It means that the dollar amounts per variables such as consumer expenditure, investment, and aggregate output do not have to be adjusted per changes in the price level. It means that these indicators don't need to adjust for changes in prices to tell us how much the real quantities of these variables change, because the price level is assumed to be fixed in the Keynesian analysis. So a price level is fixed. It means we are talking about the real quantities. The Jenkins analysis begins with a simple framework of aggregate output determination in which the role of government, net exports, and the possible effects of money and interest rates are ignored. On one side, we are saying that the price level is fixed. Okay, this is simple. Now, we are saying that there is no role of government. It means G is equal to 0. If there is no role of government, this component of the aggregate demand is 0. This will become 0 because J. Imkins assumed that there is no role of government. Besides, there is no role of net exports. It means Nx is equal to 0. This is the fourth component. And if G is 0 and Nx is 0, so we can say that YAD, aggregate demand, is equal to C plus I. And besides, the effects of money and interest rates are fixed. So J in Keynes is not including the effects of money supply and interest rates in his analysis. So the J in Keynes analysis begins with a simple framework of aggregate output determination in which the role of government, net exports, and the possible effects of money and interest rates are ignored. What do we need to analyze? We need only examine consumer expenditures, C, and investment spending, I, to explain how aggregate output is determined. Look at this aggregate demand model. We are saying that aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government plus in exports spendings. So if G is equal to 0 and if Nx is equal to 0, we are remaining with the two major components of the aggregate demand, and that are called C and I, consumption and investment. This simple framework is unrealistic. It means that how you can exclude the role of government from your analysis, how you can exclude the role of net exports from your analysis. The analysis given by the John Maynard Keynes is unrealistic because you are keeping out the possible effects of government expenditures or government taxes from the analysis. And similarly, you are keeping out the effects of net exports from your analysis. So one will say that such kind of analysis are unrealistic in nature because both government and monetary policy are left out of the picture, and because it makes other simplifying assumptions such as a fixed price level. So on one hand, you are saying that the price level is fixed, which is not fixed actually, which is not fixed in reality. This model developed by J. M. Keynes is worth studying because its simplified view helps us understand the key factors that explain how the economy works. It also clearly illustrates the Keynesian idea that the economy can come to rest at a level of aggregate output below the full employment level. Once you understand this simple framework, you can proceed to more complex and more realistic models. That's why J. M. Keynes is taking G and Nx as given, means 0. But when you able to understand the very simplest model developed by J. M. Keynes, then you can include G, mean the government expenditures in such analysis. After that, you can also include NX into your analysis. And then you would be able to understand that how the government spending or government taxes and the net exports component of the GDP affect the aggregate demand. It means that now we will focus on two terms, C and I, because we have no concern with G and NX. It means we can say that aggregate demand YAD is equal to C plus I. Now let me start my discussion from the component of C. What do we mean by the consumption function? Then I will come towards the investment component of the aggregate demand. As you know that consumers are spending money on the purchase of goods and services. So consumers are always spending money to buy consumer goods and services. Hence, income is the most important factor. If you have income, you would be able to purchase a certain amount of good or a service. J. Keynes reasoned similarly that consumer expenditures is related to disposable income. What do we mean by disposable income? Actually, disposable income is the total income available for spending. Your disposable income means that the available income with you, which you are ready to spend, which you can spend anywhere you want. And this disposable income is equal to aggregate output minus taxes. So we can write as YD. YD mean disposable income. YD is equal to Y minus T. T represent taxes, means that you have money in your pocket. And when you will pay all of your taxes to the government agency, the remaining amount of money which you can spend easily or which you can save according to your wealth, that is known as disposable income. For example, if you have 1000 Turkish lira and out of 1000 Turkish lira, you will pay 200 Turkish lira to the government as tax amount. It means your disposable income is 800 Turkish lira, not 1000, because you are liable to pay 200 Turkish lira to the government as a tax amount. That's why we are saying that YD, disposable income, is equal to Y minus T. You need to exclude tax from your income, from your amount, or from your money. The remaining amount is known as disposable income. J. M. Keynes called this relationship between disposable income and consumer expenditures the consumption function. The relationship between the disposable income of a consumer and the consumer expenditure. This is known as consumption function. We can write the consumption function as C is equal to A plus MPC multiply YD. MPC and YD are in multiplication and are in brackets. YD denotes disposable income. MPC denotes marginal propensity to consume. A denotes autonomous consumption expenditures, and C denotes total consumption expenditures made by a consumer. Let me explain you the concept of MPC first. The term MPC denotes the marginal propensity to consume, and the marginal propensity to consume is actually the slope of the consumption function line. Maybe your parents give you money for food, or maybe your parents give you money to pay for school when you have no income. So there are different sources from where you can collect money, from where you can get money. So actually this A represents the value of consumer expenditures when disposable income is equal to zero. Now suppose you have 400 billion dollars as your disposable income. Now change in disposable income 400, change in consumer expenditures 200. Why? Because change in consumer expenditure delta C is equal to MPC multiply change in disposable income. MPC is equal to 0.5 and change YD. So the multiplication will result $200. But look at the consumer expenditures, $400 billion. Similarly, if your disposable income has increased to $800 billion, again, your disposable income changes by $400 billion and your change in consumer expenditures are $200 billion, but your consumption expenditures are 600. Why? Because you are adding the term. Look at here. C is equal to A plus MPC multiply YD. You need to add this term to get the value of C. Look at the final value of the disposable income, which is $1,200 billion. Your consumption expenditures are $800 billion. It means that out of $1,200 billion, you are consuming $800 billion on purchasing the consumer goods and services. Now, if we plot this consumer expenditure schedule, you can get the consumption function in this form. Look at on the horizontal axis, we have disposable income, YD in billion dollars, and on the vertical axis, we have consumer expenditures that are in billion dollars. Look at the first point E of the graph. Point E touches the vertical axis. Actually, this is known as the y-intercept, and this y-intercept represents the level of autonomous spending. A is equal to 200. Look at the value of disposable income. It is 0. It means that if you have nothing in your pocket as disposable income, still you are consuming $200 billion. And this value is known as the autonomous consumer expenditure. But for the remaining values, if G, H, and so on, it means that if your disposable income increases, your consumer expenditures increase as well in our result. So we have the positive slope line of the consumption function. We can write that C is equal to 200 plus 0.5 YD. C is equal to 200 plus 0.5 YD. This is known as the consumption function. This C represents the total amount of consumer spending or consumer expenditures. 200 represents the autonomous consumer expenditures, and we are denoting this amount of expenditures by A from the consumption function. 0.5 represents MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, and YD represents the disposable income. So this was the concept of consumer expenditures and the consumption functions. Now we are moving towards the second important point of the J.M. Keynes analysis, which is known as investment spending, because we are saying that G is equal to 0 and X is equal to 0. So we are left with C and I. C represents the total consumption expenditures of the consumers. And this consumption component is consists of two subcomponents. The one is known as autonomous consumer expenditures, and the second one is known as marginal propensity to consume. Now, I'm going to explain you the investment component of the aggregate demand. It is important to understand that there are two types of investment. Number one, fixed investment. Number second, inventory investment. Actually, fixed investment represents the spending by firms on equipment. It represents the spending by firm units on equipment, for example, spending on machines, computers, airplanes, and structures, for example, factories, office buildings, shopping centers, and planned spending on residential housing. It means that fixed investment represents the spending on equipments, structures, and spending on residential housing. It means that fixed investment is the sum of three subcomponents, three different expenditures types. One is known as spending by firms on equipments, for example, machines, computers, airplanes. Spendings by firm on structures, for example, factories, office buildings, shopping centers. And finally, spending by firms on residential housing. What about the inventory investment? Actually, inventory investment represents the spending by firms on additional holdings of raw materials, parts, and finished goods. How we can calculate the inventory investment? The inventory investment is calculated as the change in holdings of these items in a given time period. Suppose that Compaq, which is a company that produces personal computers. So Compaq produces 1 lakh computers on December 31, 2003, and these computers are ready to be shipped to dealers. For example, if each computer has a wholesale price of $1,000, it means that one computer price is $1,000 and the company is producing 1 lakh computers. So we can say that Compaq has an inventory worth of $100 million. Now suppose if by December 31, 2004 next year, its inventory of personal computers has risen to 150 million. In the year 2013, this inventory worth is 100 million, but in the next year, the inventory worth is 150 million. It means the inventory worth has increased by $50 million. So we can say that the inventory investment in 2004 in the last year is $50 million. The change in the level of its inventory over the course of the year. For example, we can write that $150 million minus $100 million. If there is a drop in the level of inventories, inventory investment will still be negative. Okay, on the other hand, Compaq has also have some additional inventory investment if the level of raw materials and parts that it is holding to produce these computers increase over the course of the year. For example, if on December 31, 2003, it holds $20 million of computer chips used to produce its computers. In the year 2003, it means that on December 31, 2003, the company holds $20 million of computer chips, and on December December 31, 2004, the next year, it holds $30 million. It means that in the previous year it was $20 million, but in the next year, I mean to say that in the year 2004, it holds $30 million. So we can say that the company has an additional 10 million of inventory investment. An important feature of inventory investment is that some inventory investment can be unplanned. The fixed investments are the planned investment expenditures made by firm. But in the case of inventory investment, some inventory investment can be unplanned. For example, suppose that the reason Compaq find itself with an additional 50 millions of computers on December 31, 2004 is that 50 million less than computers were sold in 2004 than expected. So the company was expecting to sell more computers. But at the end of the year, the company is not able to understand the whole amount of computers produced. This 50 million of inventory investment in 2004 was unplanned. So in this situation, what the company will do? In this situation, the company is producing more computers than it can sell and will cut production. What the company will do? The best strategy will be to cut the level of production. So finally, we can say that planned investment spending is equal to planned fixed investment plus the amount of inventory investment. So when we are saying about the planned investment spending, it means that the planned investment spending is equal to the planned fixed investment and the amount of inventory investment planned by the business firms. But J. Imkins mentioned two factors that influence planned investment expenditures. It means that there are two important factors affecting the planned investment expenditures. Number one, interest rate. Number second, business expectations about the future. It means that interest rate is the first and most important factor affecting the investment level. And the second important factor is known as the business expectations about the future. Now the question is how these factors affect investment spending. We just want to explain how aggregate output is determined for a given level of planned investment expenditures. Then we will examine how interest rates and business expectations influence aggregate demand by affecting planned investment expenditures. So later on we will discuss that how planned investment spending would be changed by bringing a change in interest rates or business expectations. Look at this Keynesian Cross diagram. Actually, this represents the equilibrium position. This is the Keynesian Cross diagram. We have two building blocks. One is known as consumer expenditures, and the second one is known as planned investment spending. And these building blocks will enable us to see how aggregate output is determined when we ignore the government, when G is 0, when Nx is 0. How these two building blocks, it means that how the consumer expenditures and how the planned investment expenditures affect the aggregate output level in a particular economy or in a given economy. This diagram is actually known as Keynesian Cross diagram. It shows how aggregate output is determined. On the vertical axis, we have the aggregate demand, which is denoted by YAD. And on the horizontal axis, we have aggregate output, denoted by Y. Both values are in US billion dollars. Look at the line, the 45-degree line, the black line, which starts from the origin or which touches zero. and is moving in an upward direction from left to the right. This 45-degree line shows all the points at which aggregate output equals aggregate demand. It means that it shows all the points at which the equilibrium condition is satisfied. As you know that this was the equilibrium condition. Look at the equilibrium condition. Y is equal to YAD. As you know that government spending and net exports are zero. We can write aggregate demand as YAD is equal to C plus I. This is the aggregate demand function. YAD is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. G is equal to 0, NX is equal to 0. So we can write the aggregate demand as YAD is equal to C plus I. As you know that there is no government sector to collect taxes because we are saying that G is equal to 0. There is no government sector to collect taxes. There are none in our simplified economy. So we can say that disposable income then equals aggregate output. Look at here. We are saying that this disposable income is equal to Y minus T. This one. YD is equal to Y minus T. Means output minus tax. But we are saying that there is no role of government. That is no government sector. There is no government sector to collect taxes. It means T is equal to 0. Tax is equal to 0. If tax is equal to 0, so we can write as YD is equal to Y because YD is equal to Y minus T. If T is equal to 0, if there are no taxes, we can say that YD is equal to Y. Now suppose the consumption function with A is equal to 0. A is equal to 200. Look at the consumption function, the blue line, this line. It starts from 200. It means A is equal to 200. This is the consumption function line. C is equal to 200 plus 0.5 Y. 200 represents A, 0.5 represents MPC. As disposable income is equal to Y, we can write as C is equal to 200 plus 0.5 Y. And suppose we are saying that the value of the plant investment spending is $300 billion. Suppose I is equal to $300 billion. So aggregate demand can be written as YAD is equal to C plus I. C is equal to where C is equal to 200 plus 0.5 Y. Look at here. YAD is equal to C plus I. C is equal to 200 plus 0.5 Y. Now we are adding the term I to this model. It means that we will add 300 more amount of money. We can get 500 plus 0.5 Y. Look at the second blue line. This difference between 500 and 300 represents the planned investment expenditures. This curve will start from here, from 500. And finally, this is the aggregate demand curve. YAD is equal to C plus I, which is equal to 500 plus 0.5 Y. So this equation represents the quantity of aggregate demand at any given level of output and is called the aggregate demand function. This one, the second one, this one is known as the aggregate demand function. The aggregate demand function YAD is equal to C plus I is the vertical sum of consumption function line and planned investment spending. Look at here. It is the actually it is the vertical sum of consumption expenditures and planned expenditures. So consumption expenditures are 200 and planned expenditures are 300. So combinedly we can write 500. 200 represents the autonomous investment expenditures and 300 represents the planned investment expenditures. Now look at the point J where the blue line touches the black line. This is the equilibrium point J. This point is known as equilibrium point. This is the equilibrium point where YAD star is equal to $1,000 billion and Y star is equal to $1,000 billion. The point at which the aggregate demand function crosses the 45-degree line. I mean to say that Y is equal to YAD indicates the equilibrium level of aggregate demand and aggregate output. This represents the equilibrium level of aggregate demand and aggregate output. And this equilibrium occurs at point J with both aggregate output and aggregate demand at $1,000 billion. So at point J, we have $1,000 YAD star, which is the aggregate demand. It means that the total demand or the aggregate demand is 1000 US dollars and the aggregate output is also $1000. That's why this point is known as the equilibrium point where the aggregate output is equal to the aggregate demand. But the concept of equilibrium is useful only if there is a tendency for the economy to settle here. Actually, we are saying that this is the equilibrium condition. So, the concept of this equilibrium is useful only if there is a tendency for the economy to settle here. But as you know that the economy is not always at the equilibrium position. Look at the two cases here. Suppose when y is greater than y star. If aggregate output is greater than aggregate demand. So IU is greater than 0. Then y will decrease to y star. It means that both when y will decrease, the aggregate output will decrease to restore the economy at the equilibrium position. But look at the second case. When y is less than y star, IU is less than 0. It means y increases to y star. What does it mean? Let me give you a simple explanation. Look at the first case. Let us first look at what happens if the amount of output produced in the economy is $1,200 billion and is therefore above the equilibrium level. Look at this case, $1,200 billion. Suppose the aggregate output is $1,200 billion and this is above the equilibrium level. The equilibrium level is $1,000 billion and now we have $1,200 billion. So it means that the new equilibrium position is above the equilibrium, the original equilibrium position. At this level of output, aggregate demand is $1,100 billion. Point K. Look at point K. This is point K. And at point K, the aggregate demand is equal to $1,100 billion. It means that $1,200, which is Y, is greater than Y star. It means that the aggregate output is higher than the aggregate demand at point K. because at point K, the value of aggregate output is $1,200 billion, but the value of aggregate demand is $1,100 billion. It means that 100 billion less than 1200 billions of output. Point L. It means that the economy, the aggregate demand must be at point L, but unfortunately it is at point K. Look at the difference. IU is equal to plus 100 billion dollars. There is a difference between the two by the amount of 100 billion dollars. It means that output exceeds aggregate demand by 100 billion dollars. What the firms will do? The firms are saddled with 100 billion dollars to unsold inventory. To keep from accumulating unsold goods, firm will cut production. This is the strategy to the firm. The firm will cut production. As long as it is above the equilibrium level, output will exceed aggregate demand and firms will cut production, sending aggregate output towards the equilibrium level. So this was the first point. Look at here, because IU is greater than 0 and the value of IU in case 1 is 100 billion dollars. What the firms will do? The firms will cut production to bring the economy towards the equilibrium position. But look at the reverse case, the second case. When y is less than y star, it means that look at here, point H and I. For example, aggregate output is $800 billion and aggregate demand, the value of aggregate demand is $900 billion. It means that aggregate demand, the value of aggregate demand is higher than the value of aggregate output, and this is equal to $100 billion. So when firms do not sell all output produced, they add unsold output to their holding of inventory. And inventory investment increases. At an output level of $1,200 billion, the 100 billions of unsold goods leads to 100 billion of unplanned inventory investment, which firms do not want. But look at the second case. In the second case, what happens if the aggregate output is below the equilibrium level of output? Because the aggregate output is below the equilibrium level of output. For example, output is 800 billions. This is point H. Output is $800 billion. At this level of output, aggregate demand at point I. Look at point I, and this value is $900 billion. It means that $100 billion higher than output. It means that at point H, the aggregate output is $800 billion, but at point I, the aggregate demand is $900 billion. It means there is a difference of $100 billion. What the firms will do? At this level, firms are selling 100 billion more goods than they are producing. So inventory falls below the desired level. The negative unplanned inventory investment. Unplanned inventory investment, IU. Look at the value. IU is equal to minus 100. Unplanned investment is equal to minus $100 billion. So the negative unplanned inventory investment will induce firm to increase their production in order to raise inventory to desired level. As a result, output rises towards the equilibrium level. As long as output is below the equilibrium level, unplanned inventory investment will remain negative. Firms will continue to raise production. In the first case, they cut production, but in this case, they will increase production and output will continue to rise. So output will continue to rise. Look at the red arrow. In this case, output will continue to rise from 800 to 1000. So the tendency for the economy to settle at point J, which is the original equilibrium point, where aggregate demand equals aggregate output and unplanned inventory investment is zero. At point J, IU is equal to 0. But in the first case, IU is equal to plus 100, and in the second case here, IU is equal to minus 100.